She was born a princess, destined for an empress's crown. But what if the splendor of palaces hides a deadly trap? If love turns to betrayal and marriage becomes a curse? One innocent girl, one doomed prince, and a tragedy that will shake all of Europe. Are you ready to find out how a fairy tale turned into a nightmare? Doomed to greatness? The Laeken Palace, near Brussels, May 21st, 1864. In the vast, echoing rooms where sunlight seemed to lose its warmth before touching the heavy velvet curtains, a newborn's soft cry was heard. Princess Stéphanie Clotilde, Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte of Belgium, entered this world without fanfare. Her birth was marked with a sense of formal duty, another move in the intricate game of dynastic politics. Her father, the Duke of Brabant, the future King Leopold II, was a man with the piercing, cold eyes and soul of a conqueror. Even then, he was nurturing plans for the distant, rich lands of the Congo. He barely glanced at his newborn daughter for longer than etiquette demanded. Another princess. A thought might have crossed his mind as he leaned over the cradle, already turning to an aide waiting at the door, ready to discuss matters of state. Well, a suitable prince will be found for her when the time comes. Children, for him, were merely links in the chain of succession, pieces to be strategically placed on the grand chessboard of Europe. Her mother, Archduchess Marie Henriette of Austria, was a beauty with sad eyes that seemed to reflect the age-old melancholy of the Habsburgs. She received her daughter with quiet resignation to fate. Her own life at this cold, calculating court was far from happy, and perhaps she already foresaw the difficult path awaiting her offspring. The family Stéphanie grew up in resembled a magnificent but chilly mausoleum, where drafts of alienation blew behind the grand facades. Her parents' marriage, devoid of affection from the start, and sealed only for political necessity, quickly became a polite coexistence between two strangers, separated by an invisible wall. An early shadow fell upon their home when, in January 1869, the life of her older brother, little Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne, was cut short. Stéphanie was only 4.5, but the piercing cold that filled the air, her mother's quiet, choked sobs as she became a marble statue of grief, and the unfamiliar, oppressive silence of the vast halls were forever etched in her childhood memory. The world suddenly felt fragile, and the black clothes of the adults became an ominous portent. Her upbringing, already strict, now became almost Spartan. Her days were governed by iron discipline, rising at 5 in the morning, icy water for washing, silence while dressing, making her own bed, prayers and endless lessons in the schoolroom, where, as she recalled, in winter it was like an ice house and my teeth chattered from the cold. Once, emboldened, she showed her mother a drawing, a clumsily sketched landscape with a solitary tree. Queen Marie Henriette, merely glancing at the paper, pursed her lips. Stéphanie. Her voice was as dry as an autumn leaf. A princess must think of more important things than these idle amusements. Your duty is to serve the dynasty. Being able to draw flowers will not help you marry a king and bear him an heir. Thus, in an atmosphere of emotional vacuum, deprived of warmth and affection, the young princess, unbeknownst to herself, was being molded into a valuable asset on the dynastic market. At a court ball when she was barely 13, an elderly ambassador in a resplendent uniform approached her. He made an exaggeratedly low bow and then, for a long time, brazenly scrutinized her through his lorgnette. Stéphanie blushed deeply and felt less like a princess and more like a curious creature at an exhibition, being appraised before purchase. The great houses of Europe were already watching her, and soon her fate, it seemed, was sealed, a marriage to the heir of one of the greatest empires. But did she know, this girl with a serious, unchildishly sad gaze, that this union would lead her not to triumph, but to the very brink of an abyss? If you enjoy this story and want to hear more about forgotten destinies and royal intrigues, subscribe. There are many more fascinating stories ahead. An unequal union. In the winter of 1878, when Stéphanie was barely 14, her aunt, Archduchess Elizabeth Franziska of Austria, visited Brussels, It was then, perhaps, in the quiet of palace offices, that the idea of a marriage between the Belgian princess and the Crown Prince of Austro-Hungary was first distinctly voiced. And so, on March 4, 1880, Crown Prince Rudolf himself, the only son of the powerful Emperor Franz Joseph I and the legendary beauty Sisi, visited the Belgian court. He was 21, she was 15. Stéphanie, trembling with excitement and a little frightened by the attention of such an important personage, saw before her a young man taller than average, with lively, intelligent eyes. Yet even then, one could detect a shadow of unease in them, a kind of hidden, almost painful melancholy. Educated, interested in science and liberal ideas, which greatly troubled his conservative father, Rudolf was also impulsive, prone to bouts of melancholy, and already sought in excesses an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of the Viennese court and the weight of his destiny. The day after the Crown Prince's visit, King Leopold II, wasting no time on sentiment, summoned his daughter. "The Crown Prince of Austro-Hungary is here to ask for your hand, Stéphanie." His voice was as even as a newly minted coin, permitting no hint of doubt. "Your mother and I fully approve of this marriage." He paused, his gaze piercing, almost scrutinizing as she stood in a respectful curtsy, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. "It is our wish that you become the future Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. You may withdraw, consider this proposal, and give us your answer tomorrow." Consider? The thought, like poison, was a bitter irony to Stéphanie. A 15-year-old girl, raised in unquestioning obedience, was being asked to consider what had already been decided for her by the powerful of the world. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, to whom Stéphanie, breathless with anxiety and fear, turned for support, merely confirmed the king's words. "Mama, but I hardly know him," Stéphanie whispered, her voice trembling. "They say Vienna is such a vast, foreign city. What if—" "It will be your greatest happiness, my child," the queen interrupted. In her voice, usually so cold, there was a hint of poorly concealed hope, perhaps even envy. "To become an Austrian by marriage, imagine what an honor. You must be strong and remember your duty." That night, Stéphanie did not sleep a wink. "I never imagined," she would later write, recalling that sleepless night with bitterness, "how heavy the chains he, her father, was forging for me would prove to be." The wedding took place on May 10, 1881, in Vienna. Stéphanie was not yet 17. The ceremony was lavish, dazzling, befitting the splendor of the Austrian Empire. A heavy gown of silver brocade, embroidered with silver roses, a long train, a diamond tiara, a gift from the emperor, all were meant to symbolize majesty and happiness. But beneath the Brussels lace veil hid the pale face of a girl whose feelings, by her own admission, were much closer to those of a martyr than a bride. She stood at the altar, uttering her vows, and felt the invisible threads of duty and another's will entangling her, drawing her into an unknown, frightening future. The wedding bells faded, their peals dissolving into the Viennese air. But behind the walls of the Hofburg, a reality far from a fairy tale awaited the young crown princess. How would her life unfold in a foreign land, beside a man she barely knew, whose soul was filled with contradictions and dark forebodings? The Gilded Cage of Vienna. Her first months in Vienna, the heart of the vast empire, seemed to Stéphanie like a dazzling yet somewhat frightening dream. The Hofburg, with its endless suites of rooms and glittering chandeliers, was a world governed by its own ancient, unshakable laws. Beside Rudolf, who initially showed her some attention, she felt almost happy. "Have you read Goethe, Stéphanie?" he asked one evening as they sat in his study, lined with books from floor to ceiling. The fire in the hearth cast whimsical shadows on his face, making his eyes seem even deeper. "Only the sorrows of young Werther, Your Highness," she answered timidly, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "I'm afraid my German prose is still imperfect." "Imperfect?" He chuckled, but there was no mockery in his laugh, more a light sadness. "Werther. Yes, that is a powerful work, but perhaps you should become acquainted with his Faust. There are more questions than answers in it. but that is precisely what is valuable. Eager to become a worthy companion, capable of sharing his thoughts, Stéphanie absorbed his every word. However, this fragile semblance of well-being began to melt away like spring snow. Rudolf, as if weary of the role of attentive husband, began to disappear from their apartments more and more frequently. He would return in the early hours of the morning with a tired, distant look, carrying with him the faint but persistent scent of other women's perfume and expensive tobacco. "Rudolf, where were you so late?" she once dared to ask as he walked past her bedroom without a glance, his clothes unchanged. Her voice trembled with poorly concealed anxiety and resentment. "I waited for you for dinner." He stopped, turning slowly. His eyes, which had recently looked at her with interest, were now as cold as alpine ice. "That is none of your concern, Stéphanie," he snapped, his voice laced with an unfamiliar, cutting tone. "I have more important matters than your dinners, and do not wait up for me in the future. I am not a little boy to report my every move to you." The chasm between them grew, filled with silence and unspoken things. Stéphanie felt her loneliness acutely in the presence of her mother-in-law, Empress Elizabeth, the legendary Sisi. This eternally youthful, elusive beauty, preoccupied with her own appearance and endless travels, seemed not to notice her daughter-in-law at all. "You must be more graceful, my child," Sisi drawled one day, her assessing gaze sweeping over Stéphanie during a rare public appearance together. Her voice was melodious, like the chiming of silver bells, but her words stung like fine needles. "The Viennese court values lightness, and you are too substantial, almost like—" She did not finish, but Stéphanie understood the allusion to the offensive nickname Trampeltier, clumsy little camel, which, as helpful courtiers had informed her, the Empress used behind her back. Stéphanie merely lowered her head, feeling the blush of shame creep up her cheeks. What could she say? That her substantialness was the result of a strict upbringing, where discipline was valued above refined manners. On September 2nd, 1883, Stéphanie gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, or Ersi, as she would be known in the family. Small and pink, she seemed a miracle to Stéphanie, a ray of light in her increasingly gloomy existence. For a moment, she thought this event might bring her closer to Rudolf, but when the Crown Prince entered her chambers to see the newborn, his face expressed poorly concealed disappointment. "A girl," he said curtly, his voice devoid of warmth or joy, merely a statement of fact, almost a reproach. "Well, Austria needs an heir. I hope you will have better luck next time, madame." Stéphanie felt something inside her break. Her last hope for understanding, for closeness, had crumbled. Her days flowed in a monotonous succession of balls, receptions, and official ceremonies where she had to smile. But behind this flawless mask hid a growing emptiness. She was trapped in a gilded cage. But Stéphanie's most terrible ordeal was yet to come. The fateful illness. Rudolf's debauched lifestyle, his numerous affairs with actresses and demi-mondaines, were an open secret at the Viennese court. These liaisons reached Stéphanie as painful rumors, humiliating and insulting her. She saw him fading, but all her attempts to talk to him were met with a wall of cold indifference. Around the mid-1880s, by 1886, when Stéphanie was only 22, a terrible misfortune befell her. It began with malaise, pain, and fever. The court physicians, after much deliberation, diagnosed peritonitis. The treatment was agonizing, and Rudolf's rare formal visits only emphasized her loneliness. One day, when she felt a little better, her personal physician, an old professor she trusted, asked to speak with her alone. "Your Imperial Highness," he began in a quiet, strained voice, avoiding her gaze, "I must inform you of something most regrettable." Stéphanie's heart turned cold. "Speak, Professor," she whispered. "I am ready." "The illness you endured, it has had serious consequences." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unfortunately, Your Highness, you will no longer be able to have children." Stéphanie's world swayed. Infertility at 22. She, the crown princess, whose primary duty was to provide the empire with an heir, was barren, and the cause was her own husband. The truth, which the doctor dared not speak aloud, but which had already dawned on her with chilling horror, was terrible. Rudolf had infected her. Shock, horror, a feeling of revulsion and a humiliation washed over her. Tears streamed from her eyes. How could he? When Rudolf next entered her bedroom, she met him with an icy stare. "Do not come near me." Her voice was quiet but as firm as steel. "Never touch me again." He stopped, surprised. "Stéphanie, what is the meaning of this?" he stammered. "It means..." She rose slowly from her pillows, her figure seeming fragile yet unbending. "That you have ruined my life. You have made me unclean. You have taken my future. Get out." Their bedrooms were separated. Betrayed, ill, and realizing her future as a mother and empress was destroyed, Stéphanie distanced herself from her husband. Rudolf, tormented by his own demons, sank deeper into despair. Rudolf's spiral of despair. Meanwhile, Rudolf, as if caught in an invisible vortex, was rapidly spiraling downwards. His liberal ideas met a wall of incomprehension from his conservative father. Their rare political discussions ended either in the emperor's icy silence or an open quarrel, after which Rudolf would withdraw for long periods, tormented by a sense of uselessness. "This empire is doomed!" he bitterly exclaimed one day to his close friend Count Hoyos, after a clash with his father. "They are all blind! And I can change nothing! I am merely a puppet!" This political frustration was exacerbated by his progressing illness, perhaps the consequences of the very ailment he had so carelessly passed on to Stéphanie, as well as rampant drinking and, as was increasingly whispered at court, morphine use. His behavior became more erratic. Bouts of dark melancholy alternated with flashes of feverish activity and talk of death. One evening, when Stéphanie, steeling herself, entered his study to try to persuade him to see a doctor, she found him pale, his hands trembling. A broken glass lay on the floor. "Rudolf, I beg you," she began softly. "You need to rest. Let me call Professor Weiderhofer." He spun around, and in his eyes she saw only madness and despair. "Leave me, Stéphanie!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You understand nothing! I am suffocating in this damned cage! Get out!" His eyes burned with an unhealthy fire. Stéphanie recoiled, an icy fear gripping her heart. This was no longer the Rudolf she knew. In 1888, persistent rumors reached Stéphanie of the Crown Prince's new passion 17-year-old Baroness Marie Vetsera. Young and adoring, she seemed captivated by his attention. Vienna buzzed with gossip about their meetings, gifts, and his obvious infatuation. For Stéphanie, each new piece of news was another humiliation, a reminder of her own position, a wife from whom her husband sought solace elsewhere. She saw Rudolf, as if in a fever, throw himself into this new romance, and it only increased her anxiety for his sanity. Another victim of his charm and his madness, she thought bitterly, observing from afar. Rudolf's talk of suicide became more insistent. Stéphanie learned that he had even appealed to the Pope to annul their marriage, so he could, as he claimed, marry Marie, but was flatly refused. This news further convinced her he was on the brink. Seeing her husband inexorably heading for disaster, Stéphanie could not remain indifferent. It is said that, gathering her last strength, she obtained an audience with Emperor Franz Joseph. "Your son is ill, Your Majesty," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "He is not himself. He says terrible things. He might do something irreparable. I implore you, do something before it is too late." The Emperor, seated at his enormous desk, merely frowned. "The Crown Prince has always been somewhat eccentric, Madame," he replied dryly, without looking up from his papers. "One must not exaggerate. He has his duties, and he will perform them. Your fears, I am afraid, are unfounded." The conversation was over. Stéphanie left with a sense of complete helplessness and impending doom. She had not been heard. The Crown Prince's days were numbered. In the secluded hunting lodge of Mayerling, the final, most terrible scene of this long drama was about to unfold. The Mayerling tragedy. The morning of January 30th, 1889 at Mayerling was frosty and gray. The snow-covered trees of the Vienna woods stood motionless, as if holding their breath in anticipation of disaster. The hunting lodge, Crown Prince Rudolf's favorite retreat, usually filled with noise and activity during his visits, now seemed plunged into an ominous, unnatural silence. The previous day, Rudolf, claiming a slight indisposition and a desire to rest in solitude, had dismissed most of his retinue. Only his faithful valet, Loschek, and Count Joseph Hoyos, one of his closest companions, remained with him. It was Loschek who first sensed that something was amiss. The Crown Prince, usually an early riser, had not emerged from his chambers. "Your Imperial Highness," Loschek called, knocking on the bedroom door. There was no answer. Again, louder. Silence. The alarmed valet rushed to Count Hoyos. "Count, something is wrong," his voice trembled. "His Highness is not responding." Together, they went to the door. It was locked from the inside. Growing unease turned into a chilling premonition. After several futile attempts to get a response, Count Hoyos, seeing no other option, nodded to Loschek. "Break down the door, Loschek, quickly!" The valet, grabbing a small axe, broke the lock with a few blows. What met their eyes in the dim room, where a faint winter light barely penetrated the heavy, drawn curtains, was horrific. The air hung heavy with the faint but distinct smell of gunpowder and something else, sickly sweet, that made them nauseous. On the wide bed in unnatural frozen positions lay two bodies. Crown Prince Rudolf, the 30-year-old heir to a mighty empire, was dead. His face, contorted by a death grimace, was covered in blood from a wound to his temple. Beside him, almost embracing him, lay young Baroness Marie Vetsera, her 17 years cut short just as suddenly and tragically. Her pale, almost childlike face was serene, as if she were asleep, but a dark stain on her white nightgown left no doubt. She too was dead. On the nightstand lay Rudolf's revolver and two glasses, one of which was overturned. Count Hoyos, a seasoned man not easily frightened, turned as white as a sheet. "My God," he whispered, taking a step back. His first instinct was to conceal the terrible scene, to prevent it from becoming public. "Loschek," his voice was barely audible. "Not a word to anyone. Not a single soul. Understand? Lock the door and stay here. I am going to Vienna immediately." The news, delivered by Hoyos, struck the Hofburg like a thunderbolt. Initial shock gave way to panic and confusion. Emperor Franz Joseph, old and hardened by countless political storms and personal tragedies, seemed for a moment to lose his famous composure. The loss of his only son, the heir to the throne, and under such scandalous circumstances, it was a blow from which the empire might not recover. Feverish attempts to conceal the true cause of Rudolf's death began at once. The first official version stated that the Crown Prince had died of a heart attack. Marie Vetsera's body was secretly removed from Mayerling under cover of night and hastily buried in a small village cemetery near the Heiligenkreuz monastery in an effort to erase all traces of her presence with the Crown Prince in his final hours. But the truth could not be contained. Rumors, each more frightful than the last, spread through Vienna and then throughout Europe. "Murder," was whispered in salons. "A political conspiracy," blared opposition newspapers. Names were mentioned, intrigues were woven. Gradually, however, under the pressure of irrefutable facts and details leaked to the press, the imperial court was forced to admit, albeit with considerable reservations, a version closer to the truth. Crown Prince Rudolf had committed suicide after shooting his mistress, Marie Vetsera. Whether it was a coordinated double suicide, a romantic pact between two desperate lovers, or whether Rudolf, in a fit of madness or despair, first killed Marie and then himself, no one will ever know for sure. The suicide notes found later only added to the tragedy and confusion. In a letter to his mother, Rudolf wrote of his right to end his life. In a letter to his wife Stéphanie, he begged for forgiveness, saying she was delivered from his pernicious presence. The entire empire was plunged into mourning. Black flags flew over government buildings, portraits of the Crown Prince draped in crepe were displayed in shop windows, but behind the official grief lay bewilderment, fear for the future, and a multitude of unspoken questions. The death of the heir to the throne threw not only the Austrian court, but all of Europe into a state of shock. A dynastic crisis was evident. Who would now be heir to the old emperor? How would this tragedy affect the fragile balance of power in the multi-ethnic empire, already torn by internal contradictions? The Mayerling tragedy became more than just the personal drama of a few individuals. It became a symbol of decline, a harbinger of the future catastrophes that would shake Europe in the next century. Rudolf's death exposed the deep cracks in the foundation of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, its inability to adapt to new times, its internal decay hidden behind a glittering facade. The empire had lost its heir. The closed circle of Habsburg family tragedies had gained another terrible link. And what of Stéphanie? Overnight, she had become a widow, a young woman whose life had been so cruelly marred by the man who now lay dead in his hunting lodge. What was her true reaction to the death of her husband, who had brought her so much suffering, humiliation, and pain, but with whom she was bound by years of marriage, a daughter, and unfulfilled hopes? A widow and an outcast? 24 years old. An age when, for many, life is just opening its doors, promising endless horizons. For Stéphanie, however, these 24 years had encompassed an eternity of unfulfilled hopes, humiliations, and bitter losses. Now, she was a widow. The widow of a crown prince whose name had only yesterday resounded throughout Europe, and today was spoken only with a shudder and in hushed tones. And, as she herself knew with excruciating clarity, and as was known to only a small circle of initiates, she was a widow incapable of providing the Habsburg dynasty with any more heirs. The chain that had bound her so long and so tightly to this foreign, cold land seemed to have snapped with a deafening clang, yet it brought no expected sense of liberation. Her soul became a tangled knot of conflicting emotions. Grief. Yes, undoubtedly, it was there. Despite all her suffering, Rudolf had been her husband, the father of her only daughter, little Ersi. Somewhere in the most hidden corners of her memory, a faint, flickering ember of recollection still glowed. Memories of those first brief months of their life together, when, naive and full of hope, she had believed in the possibility of happiness, in his sharp intellect, in his brilliant future. And that future had now been mercilessly snuffed out by a gunshot in a secluded hunting lodge. She looked at the black crepe that draped the mirrors in her apartments and saw not her own reflection, but an emptiness, yawning where her life had once been. But intertwined with this natural human sorrow, like poisonous ivy, was another, sharper and perhaps stronger emotion relief. Yes, she dared not admit it even to herself, but that is precisely what it was. Relief that the nightmare, which had lasted for years, had finally ended. His suicide note, handed to her along with other papers, seemed to sear this word onto her heart. A few clumsy, hurried lines, written in a familiar yet so alien hand, in which he, expressing some belated, dim affection, as if in justification, wrote, "You are delivered from my pernicious presence." "Delivered," she whispered, rereading those words again and again, and they, like a distorted mirror, reflected the entire abyss of their unhappy union. He himself, on the brink of death, had acknowledged his ruinous role in her life. A cold smile touched her lips. Yes, Rudolf delivered, but at what cost? The Viennese court, cloaked in deep mourning, met her with a new, even more palpable alienation. If before she had merely been the unloved, clumsy daughter-in-law, now her presence was seen as a living, painful reminder of the scandal, the disgrace, the tragedy that had shaken the foundations of the empire. Emperor Franz Joseph, receiving her in his study for official condolences, was curt and reserved. His face, which seemed carved from gray stone, expressed nothing but weariness and habitual severity. "Madame," his voice was devoid of any warmth, The empire mourns the loss of the crown prince. Your position at court remains unchanged. You are the Dowager Crown Princess, mother of Archduchess Elizabeth Marie. Thank you, Your Majesty, Stéphanie replied softly, feeling an icy grip tighten around her heart. Not a word of sympathy, not a hint of human compassion, merely a statement of fact, a reminder of her duties. She was shunned, as if she carried a plague. Receptions and official events, which she was still obliged to attend, became an exquisite torture, a wall of icy silence or formal, meaningless condolences, behind which lurked unconcealed curiosity and malicious pleasure. The thought of returning to Belgium, to her homeland, where she imagined she might find some peace, dissolved like morning mist. Her daughter, little Erzé, was an Archduchess of Austria, and Stéphanie, bound to her, to this court, and to this city that had become her prison, could not leave her. She found herself trapped once more, in a gilded cage whose bars were now forged from grief, loneliness, and an oppressive uncertainty. A former crown princess, the mother of a princess of the blood, but without power, influence, or hope for personal happiness. A woman whose youth had been stolen and whose soul was left desolate. The Mayerling tragedy became a fatal dividing line, forever splitting her life into before and after. She outlived her husband by many decades, almost half a century, but the shadow of those terrible events, it seemed, haunted her to the very end. What path would she choose now, in this hostile, empty world? And could she ever find the peace she had been denied since her youth? That question remained open, and the answer was known only to fate itself. If you enjoy experiencing history through storytelling, make sure to subscribe. Many more fascinating tales await. This story is inspired by real events but includes elements of artistic fiction. Up next, you will see a list of historical facts that formed its foundation.